Snoop Dogg, the famous rapper, actor, and entrepreneur, was always known for his laid-back personality and deep connection to the streets. But one day, he decided to do something different, something no one would ever expect. He wanted to find out how homeless people were really treated by others, especially the police. The idea came to him while he was talking to one of his old friends, a man who had grown up in the same tough neighborhood as Snoop but had fallen on hard times. His friend shared stories about how people ignored him, judged him, and how he was treated unfairly by the police simply because he didn't have a place to live. Snoop was shocked. "Man, that ain't right," he said. That's when Snoop decided he needed to see the truth for himself. But how? He couldn't just walk up to people as Snoop Dogg and expect them to treat him like a regular person. Everyone would recognize him, and they'd act differently. No, he had to go undercover. Snoop called up one of Hollywood's best makeup artists. He explained his plan, and the artist was excited to help. Over the next few days, they worked together to create a perfect disguise. Snoop's face was covered in layers of makeup to make him look older and tired. His signature braids were hidden under a worn-out beanie, and his flashy clothes were replaced with torn jeans, an oversized jacket, and old shoes that looked like they had seen better days. When he looked in the mirror, Snoop barely recognized himself. "Man, I look rough," he said with a chuckle. But that was the point. Snoop didn't want anyone to guess who he was. He wanted people to see him the way they saw any homeless person on the street. He even practiced his role, changing the way he walked and talked to make his performance convincing. The next morning, Snoop set out on his mission. He chose a busy area in downtown Los Angeles, where he knew he would find a mix of people, business professionals, tourists, and locals. Pushing a rusty old shopping cart filled with random items, he found a spot on the sidewalk and sat down. He held up a simple cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Anything else?" At first, it felt strange. Snoop was used to being the center of attention wherever he went, with fans screaming his name and cameras flashing. But now, no one seemed to notice him. People walked past without even looking at him. Some glanced in his direction but quickly turned away, pretending he wasn't there. Snoop started to understand what his friend had told him. Being ignored like this felt lonely. It made him think about how hard life must be for people who have to live like this every day. But Snoop wasn't just there to experience the loneliness. He wanted to see how the police treated someone like him. As the day went on, he noticed a patrol car slowly driving by. Two officers inside seemed to be watching him. Snoop braced himself. "Here we go," he thought. And so, his experiment began. Snoop Dogg sat on the cold, hard pavement, his cardboard sign resting in his lap. The sun was hot, and the occasional gust of wind carried the scent of city life. Food from nearby street vendors mixed with the faint smell of exhaust. For the first time in years, Snoop felt invisible. People walked by in a hurry, their eyes glued to their phones or focused on their own problems. No one paused to look at him. A few glanced his way but quickly looked away as if seeing him was too uncomfortable. Snoop thought to himself, "Man, it's like I don't even exist." As he sat there, his stomach began to rumble. He hadn't eaten since early that morning, and now he was getting a taste of what it felt like to go hungry. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bottle of water he had brought along. Even though this was just an experiment, the feeling of thirst and hunger was very real. Nearby, Snoop noticed a man and a woman arguing loudly over something trivial. The woman clutched her purse tightly as she glanced in his direction. "Let's go," she said to the man, pulling him away as if Snoop were a threat. Snoop couldn't believe it. He wasn't doing anything but sitting quietly, yet people still treated him like he was dangerous. It made him wonder how many homeless people had to deal with this kind of judgment every single day. As the day dragged on, Snoop watched the world from his spot on the sidewalk. He saw a businessman in a suit stride by, talking loudly into his phone. A mother hurried past with her young daughter, shielding the little girl's eyes when they walked near him. A group of teenagers laughed and pointed at him from across the street, making jokes he couldn't hear but could easily guess. But it wasn't all bad. A kind older woman passed by and placed a granola bar in his hand without saying a word. She smiled gently and walked away. "Thank you," Snoop said, genuinely touched by the small act of kindness. It wasn't much, but it reminded him that not everyone was indifferent or judgmental. As the afternoon wore on, Snoop began to feel the strain of being out in the elements. His back hurt from sitting on the hard ground, and his throat was dry despite the water he had sipped earlier. The experience was starting to weigh on him, both physically and emotionally. Suddenly, he noticed a police car slow down as it approached. Two officers were inside, their eyes scanning the street. One of them spotted Snoop and said something to his partner. The car came to a stop a few feet away, and both officers stepped out. Snoop's heart raced. He had been waiting for this moment all day, but now that it was happening, he felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. Would they treat him with respect, or would they judge him like so many others had? The officers approached slowly, their expressions unreadable. "Excuse me, sir," one of them said. "Can we have a word?" Snoop nodded, staying calm. "Sure," he replied, his voice low and gravelly to match his disguise. This was it. The real test was about to begin. The two officers stood in front of Snoop, their uniforms crisp and their gazes sharp. Snoop, still disguised as a homeless man, kept his head low, playing his part. He held onto his cardboard sign as if it were a shield, feeling the weight of their stares. "Do you have permission to sit here?" the taller officer asked, his tone firm but not aggressive. Snoop glanced up briefly, careful not to draw too much attention to himself. "No, officer," he replied, keeping his voice rough and tired. "I'm just trying to get by. That's all." The shorter officer crossed his arms, studying him closely. "Do you know it's against the law to block this sidewalk? People need to walk through here." Snoop nodded slowly. "I ain't trying to cause no trouble. I'll move if y'all want me to." The taller officer's expression softened just a little. "Where are you from? Do you have any ID on you?" Snoop hesitated for a moment. He had planned for this and carried a fake ID that matched his disguise. He reached into his pocket and handed it over. The officer examined it carefully before handing it back without comment. While this was happening, a small crowd started to gather nearby. A few people paused to watch, their curiosity piqued by the sight of the police talking to what appeared to be a homeless man. Snoop noticed some of them whispering and pointing, but he kept his focus on the officers. The shorter officer seemed more skeptical. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "A few weeks," Snoop answered, sticking to the story he had rehearsed. "Lost my job, then my place. Just trying to figure things out." The taller officer sighed and looked at his partner. "He's not hurting anyone," he said quietly, though Snoop could still hear him. "Let's not make a big deal out of this." But before the officers could leave, another voice cut through the air. "Hey, is everything okay here?" Snoop turned to see a young rookie officer walking up to join them. Her uniform was neat, and her face was kind but serious. She had clearly just arrived on the scene and was trying to assess the situation. "We were just talking to him," the taller officer explained, "making sure he's not causing any trouble." The rookie officer looked at Snoop, her expression softening as she took in his worn-out appearance. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need help?" Snoop was surprised by her tone. It wasn't harsh or judgmental. Instead, it sounded genuine, like she actually cared. "I'm okay," he said quietly, "just trying to make it through the day." The rookie officer nodded. "There are shelters nearby if you need a place to stay. I can give you some information if you'd like." The other two officers exchanged glances but said nothing. Snoop could see the difference in how the rookie treated him compared to them. It was subtle but clear. "Thank you," Snoop said, his voice carrying a hint of sincerity beneath his disguise. As the officers walked back to their car, the rookie lingered for a moment, handing Snoop a small card with shelter information. "Take care of yourself, okay?" she said with a kind smile before leaving. Snoop watched her walk away, feeling a mix of emotions. He had seen two very different sides of law enforcement in just a few minutes. The test was far from over, but this encounter had given him a lot to think about. Snoop Dogg watched as the two officers walked back to their patrol car, exchanging a few words in low voices. He could feel their eyes on him, but this time, he wasn't sure if it was because of his disguise or the way the rookie had treated him. The contrast between her kind words and the other officer's skepticism was clear, and Snoop was left wondering just how many other homeless people experienced the same kind of treatment. He sat still, taking a deep breath, trying to process everything that had just happened. But just as he was beginning to reflect on the situation, the police car pulled away, only to stop a little further down the street. The two officers inside seemed to be discussing something, and Snoop could feel the tension in the air. After a few minutes, the police car slowly turned back around and stopped near him again. This time, the officers didn't get out of the car right away. Instead, they watched him closely from inside, making sure they had a clear view. Snoop wondered if they were trying to figure out if he was telling the truth about being homeless or if they were just suspicious of him. Then, the taller officer, the one who had spoken to him earlier, rolled down the window. "Hey," he called out. "You need to move along. We're going to have to ask you to clear the sidewalk." Snoop felt a knot form in his stomach. He had expected this kind of response, but that didn't make it any easier. Why was it always like this? He thought. People were quick to judge, to push away those who were struggling. He nodded, playing along. "All right, I'm moving," he said, pushing the shopping cart slowly down the sidewalk, pretending to struggle with the weight of it. He wanted to see if they would follow him, if they would keep up their pressure. To his surprise, the police car didn't follow. Instead, they stayed back, watching him carefully but making no further moves. For a few minutes, Snoop continued his slow walk, glancing over his shoulder now and then to see if they would approach again. But the car remained in place, and he wondered if they had finally decided to leave him alone. Just as he reached a corner, however, the situation took another unexpected turn. The younger officer from before, who had shown him kindness, stepped out of the patrol car. She walked toward him with a calm, reassuring expression on her face, her hands at her sides. "Hey," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I know this is tough, but there's a shelter nearby where you can get a meal and some rest. I'll give you a ride if you want." Snoop was caught off guard. This wasn't what he had expected at all. He had prepared himself for more conflict, for more resistance. But here was this rookie officer, offering him help when no one else had. He paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. "I'm good, really. Just trying to get by," he replied, not wanting to give away too much. But the officer didn't back down. "I get it," she said, "but you don't have to do this alone. If you change your mind, I'll be right here." She handed him another card with shelter information, just like before, and gave him a reassuring smile. As she walked back to her patrol car, Snoop stood there for a moment, holding the card in his hand. He couldn't believe how different this interaction had been compared to the earlier ones. The rookie officer's kindness had made an impact on him, and he realized just how much small acts of compassion could change someone's day or even their life. Snoop glanced at the card one more time before slipping it into his pocket. He wasn't sure what he would do next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about testing the police anymore. It was about understanding the real challenges people faced when they had nowhere to turn. As the day went on, Snoop continued to move from one spot to another on the busy street. He kept his head down, pushing his cart with a slow, tired shuffle. His back ached from sitting and walking for so long, and his stomach growled louder than before. But in between the discomfort, something was beginning to shift inside him. He had expected the streets to be harsh, and they were. He had expected people to ignore him, and most of them did. But there was also a growing sense of clarity about how little people understood the struggle of being homeless. For some, it was just something they saw as a problem to avoid or ignore. But for others, it was a daily battle for survival. Snoop thought back to the rookie officer's words. "You don't have to do this alone." Her kindness had stayed with him. It was strange how one small act of compassion could make such a big difference in a person's day. He felt a small but important shift in how he saw the world around him. He kept walking, trying to blend in with the busy city streets. But then something caught his eye. A woman sitting on a nearby bench, looking down at her feet. She was hunched over, her face hidden by her long hair. Snoop could tell she was upset. Something inside him made him stop. He had no idea why, but he felt a pull to talk to her, to connect with someone who was going through the same thing he was. Maybe it was because he understood now, more than ever, how important it was to feel seen. Snoop took a deep breath, pushing the cart toward the bench. When he reached her, he hesitated for a second. "Hey," he said softly, trying to sound gentle, not wanting to startle her. The woman looked up, surprised. Her eyes were red from crying, and her clothes were torn. She didn't speak at first but just nodded, as if acknowledging his presence. "Are you okay?" Snoop asked, sitting down next to her. It felt strange, sitting there in his disguise, talking to someone who didn't know who he was. But in that moment, he didn't care. "I'm fine," she replied quietly, but her voice cracked. It was clear she wasn't fine. Not at all. Snoop didn't push her for more details. Instead, he just sat beside her, offering quiet company. He knew how important it was just to have someone there, even if they didn't say anything. Sometimes, the silence was the most comforting thing. After a long pause, the woman spoke again. "I'm just so tired," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tired of pretending everything's okay when it's not. Tired of not being seen." Snoop's heart went out to her. He had been there too. He had felt that same loneliness and desperation. He had been ignored, judged, and forgotten. But in that moment, he realized something important. No one was truly invisible if they found someone who cared enough to look. The woman looked at him for a moment, as if seeing him for the first time. "What's your story?" she asked. Snoop hesitated. He didn't want to tell her who he really was. Not yet. But he shared a little of his own struggle, just enough to make her feel like she wasn't alone. "You're not alone," he said gently, feeling the weight of his words. "I get it. I really do." They sat in silence for a few moments longer. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the middle of a busy, indifferent world, they had found a brief moment of connection. Snoop stood up slowly, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't expected. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You're worth it." He turned and walked away, his mind racing with everything he had learned so far. The day wasn't over, but already it had changed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. As Snoop continued to walk through the crowded streets, his mind was full of the conversation he had just had with the woman on the bench. He had never really stopped to think about how deep the loneliness could run for people who had nothing. It was easy for him to forget that not everyone had the luxury of being seen, of being acknowledged. For some, just being treated like a human being felt like a rare gift. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a police car slowly pulling up next to him. The car stopped, and the window rolled down. It was the same two officers from earlier, the ones who had first stopped to question him. Snoop could feel his heart race a little, unsure of what was going to happen next. Would they treat him the same way, or would they have more questions? The taller officer, who had seemed skeptical before, leaned out the window. "Hey, you still around here?" he asked in a voice that sounded less harsh than before. Snoop took a deep breath. "Yeah," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm just trying to get by." The officer looked at him for a moment before speaking again. "We didn't mean to make things hard for you," he said, though his words sounded a little uncomfortable. "But we have to follow the rules." Snoop nodded, but he didn't say anything in return. He wasn't sure what to make of this sudden change in tone. Was this just a way to get rid of him, or did they really care? Before he could respond, the rookie officer from earlier appeared on the scene. She had been walking down the street when she spotted Snoop and the two officers. As soon as she saw the situation, she walked over with a calm, purposeful stride. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes scanning the scene. The two officers explained the situation briefly, but Snoop could tell they were uncomfortable with the way things were going. They had questioned him earlier, but now, with the rookie officer around, there was an unease in the air. The rookie officer turned her attention to Snoop. "Are you doing okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. "If you're still in need, there's a shelter nearby where you can get some food and a place to sleep for the night." Snoop looked at her, surprised by her kindness. Earlier in the day, he had been skeptical of her, unsure if she was just following orders like the other officers. But now, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, he realized she wasn't just doing her job. She genuinely wanted to help. "I'm fine," Snoop replied, though it wasn't entirely true. He had been feeling more tired as the day went on, and the idea of a warm meal and a bed for the night seemed tempting. But something in him didn't want to take the easy way out. He wasn't sure if he was ready to accept the help just yet. The rookie officer seemed to understand, though. "I'm not pushing you," she said. "I just want you to know there's support if you need it." For a moment, Snoop was quiet. He wasn't sure if he could trust anyone anymore, but this officer had been the one person to show him a little bit of kindness when no one else had. Maybe she was different. Maybe the world wasn't as cold as it seemed. "Thanks," Snoop said finally, slipping the card she had given him into his pocket. "I'll think about it." The rookie officer gave him a small smile. "Take care of yourself," she said before turning back to the car. As she walked away, Snoop stood there for a moment, feeling a mixture of emotions. He had come into this experiment to test the system, to see how the police treated people like him. But now, he realized it wasn't just about the test. It was about finding the people who were willing to make a difference, no matter how small. The other two officers slowly drove off, leaving Snoop standing alone in the middle of the street. But this time, it didn't feel as lonely. The day had been long, and the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the busy streets of downtown Los Angeles. Snoop Dogg, still in his disguise, walked slowly down the sidewalk, the weight of his shopping cart making his arms feel heavy. The world around him continued to rush by, indifferent to his presence. But as he continued his journey, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had learned so far. The rookie officer's kindness had made a lasting impression on him, and the way the other officers had treated him, at first with suspicion, then with discomfort, had opened his eyes to how easy it was for people to be ignored when they had nothing to their name. Snoop knew he was getting closer to the end of his experiment, but a part of him wasn't ready to stop just yet. He had come here to understand what it was like to be treated like someone invisible, someone the world didn't want to see. But now he had a much deeper understanding of the problem. He had seen how some people, even police officers, could treat someone with kindness, but he had also seen how others were quick to judge. As he walked, Snoop spotted a group of people standing on the corner, laughing and chatting. They didn't seem to notice him at first, but as he approached, one of them looked up and did a double take. "Wait a minute," the person said, pointing at him. "Is that?" Snoop's heart skipped a beat. It was as if the world was about to turn upside down. He had been expecting this moment for a while, but now that it was happening, he wasn't sure how to feel. The person who had noticed him called out to the others, "Hey, is that Snoop Dogg?" The group froze for a second, and Snoop could see the confusion on their faces. They had been so sure that they were seeing the famous rapper, but at the same time, they couldn't believe it. Snoop took a deep breath and decided it was time to end the game. Slowly, he pulled off his beanie, revealing his familiar braids. The transformation was immediate. The group gasped, some even stepping back in surprise. "No way," one of them said. "It really is Snoop Dogg." Snoop stood there, smiling as the realization spread through the crowd. He hadn't expected such a reaction, but it was clear that no one had seen this coming. The people who had been walking past him all day without a second glance were now staring in awe. A few of them took out their phones, snapping pictures and recording videos, while others rushed forward, eager to get a closer look. Snoop couldn't help but laugh, realizing how quickly things had shifted. Just moments ago, he had been invisible to these same people, but now, he was the center of attention again. The group started asking him questions, excited to meet him in person. But Snoop wasn't focused on the questions or the attention. He was more interested in what had just happened, how quickly people's perceptions changed when they found out who he really was. After a few minutes of conversation, Snoop raised his hand to signal that it was time to move on. All right, he said, smiling. I've got a little surprise for you all. But before you start taking too many pictures, I want you to know why I did this. He explained the entire experiment, the reason for his disguise, the treatment he had experienced as a homeless person, and what he had learned about how society often ignores those in need. The crowd fell quiet as they listened, some nodding in understanding. It was a moment of realization, not just for them, but for Snoop as well. He had come here to test the system, but what he had found was far more powerful than he expected. He had seen the difference one person could make, the rookie officer, the woman on the bench, and even the kindness of strangers who offered help without asking anything in return. As the crowd dispersed, Snoop stood there for a moment longer, reflecting on everything he had experienced. The world might not be perfect, but it wasn't completely broken either. There was still kindness, and there were still people willing to make a difference. He had come to the streets to test others, but in the end, it was himself who had been changed. As the evening wore on, and the streets began to quiet down, Snoop Dogg walked away from the crowd of excited fans who had gathered around him. His mind was spinning with everything he had experienced during the day. What had started as a simple experiment to see how the police treated homeless people had turned into something much deeper, something that would stay with him for a long time. Snoop had expected to learn about the police, how they handled situations involving the homeless, and how they saw people like him. But in reality, the day had taught him far more than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about the police. It was about people, about how we see one another, and how we treat those who are struggling. The kindness of the rookie officer had left a lasting impression on him. She was the first person that day who had treated him like a person, not a problem. Her offer of help, her simple acknowledgement of his struggle, had shown him what it meant to truly care. In a world where so many people were quick to judge, she had taken the time to offer kindness without expecting anything in return. On the other hand, the older officers had treated him like an inconvenience, a person to be pushed aside. Their approach had felt cold and distant, as if they were more concerned with following rules than understanding what was truly happening. Snoop had seen firsthand how easy it was for people to slip through the cracks, how quickly they could be written off as just another face in the crowd. And then there was the woman on the bench, the one he had spoken to earlier. She had reminded him of how deep the pain of loneliness could go. She had felt invisible, like so many people do when they're down on their luck. In that moment, Snoop had realized that it wasn't just about surviving the day. It was about being seen, being heard. The more he thought about it, the more Snoop realized that it wasn't just about homelessness either. It was about how society treats anyone who doesn't fit into the mold of what's considered normal. Whether it's people on the streets, people from different backgrounds, or anyone who doesn't have the same advantages, there was a common thread of being overlooked. Snoop had the privilege of being the celebrity, someone who was always noticed, always recognized. But for most people, being invisible was a daily reality. It was something he hadn't fully understood until now. By the time he made his way back to the corner where he had started, Snoop felt a shift inside him. He had seen both sides, the good and the bad, and it had changed his perspective. The world might seem indifferent at times, but there was still hope. People still cared. It wasn't always obvious, But there were moments of kindness, moments of connection that could make a real difference. He pulled out the card the rookie officer had given him earlier and looked at it once more. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a reminder that help was always available, that people like her were out there, trying to make things better. Snoop didn't know what he would do with all the information he had gained, but one thing was clear. He couldn't just let this experience fade away. He had a platform, a voice that could be heard, and he knew that it was time to use it for something bigger than just his music or his fame. The day had been an eye-opener, but it was only the beginning. Snoop wasn't going to forget what he had learned. He would make sure the world knew that there were still people out there who cared, and that no one should ever feel invisible. He walked off into the night, with a new purpose in his heart. The days after his experiment on the streets passed quickly, but Snoop Dogg couldn't shake the feeling that his experience had changed him. The kindness of the rookie officer, the unexpected encounter with the woman on the bench, and the way people had treated him, all of it was still fresh in his mind. As a celebrity, Snoop had often been in the spotlight, but this time he had seen the world from a completely different perspective. He had learned more about people, about struggles, and about kindness than he ever expected. Now, he knew he had to share what he had discovered with the world. The first step was obvious. Snoop knew that he had to talk about his experience. He took to social media, posting about his day on the streets in the disguise of a homeless person. He shared the moments of kindness and the harshness he had experienced. He talked about how quickly people judged him when they thought he was homeless, but also about how powerful it was to feel seen, to feel like a person, instead of just a problem to be ignored. The post went viral. People reacted with a mix of surprise, admiration, and deep reflection. Many thanked Snoop for opening their eyes to a side of society they hadn't paid attention to before. Others shared their own stories of being treated unfairly or ignored because they didn't fit into society's expectations. The conversation quickly expanded, and soon, news outlets were reaching out to interview him about what he had experienced. But Snoop didn't want this to be just another viral moment. He wanted to make a lasting impact. He started reaching out to organizations that worked with the homeless, asking how he could help. He visited shelters, talking to people who had firsthand experience of what it was like to live without a home. He listened to their stories, and he learned even more about the deep systemic issues that kept people trapped in this cycle. The more he learned, the more determined he became. Snoop knew that there was so much more to be done. It wasn't just about providing food or shelter. It was about changing the way society viewed homelessness. He began to speak out about the need for more compassion, understanding, and support for people who had fallen through the cracks. He used his platform to bring attention to the issue, advocating for better policies and better treatment for those in need. His work didn't stop there. Snoop teamed up with the rookie officer he had met during his experiment to help launch a program aimed at training police officers on how to approach situations involving homeless individuals with empathy and understanding. He wanted to make sure that future interactions, like the one he had experienced on the streets, would be handled with care and respect. As the weeks went by, Snoop's efforts began to gain traction. More and more people joined the conversation, sharing their support for the movement. Snoop knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to keep pushing forward. He knew that if he could help just a few people understand what it felt like to be invisible, then it was all worth it. He wasn't just Snoop Dogg anymore. He was a voice for the voiceless, an advocate for those who were often ignored. And though the road ahead was long, Snoop was ready to walk it, one step at a time. As he looked back on his experiment, he realized that it had never been about proving a point or making a statement. It had been about seeing the world with new eyes and understanding the power of kindness and empathy. And in that understanding, he had found his true purpose. The movement was just beginning, and Snoop was ready to lead the way.